Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Vayigash Tafshin Pei Aleph. And we're going to start at the beginning. Now, the Parsha, just a little bit of quick background where the Parsha begins at. We know last week's Parsha, Yosef accuses his brothers of being spies, tells them you can only prove your innocence if you bring your brother Binyamin down. They bring their brother Binyamin down. Yosef plants his goblet in Binyamin's sack. And when the goblet is found in his sack, Yosef says, Binyamin has to stay here as a slave. The rest of you can go home. And our Parsha begins with the Yehuda approaching Yosef to discuss this matter. And the Parsha says, Vayigash elav Yehuda. And Yehuda approached him, Vayomer, and he said, Bi Adoni, please my master. Yabana avda chadav baznei Adoni. Let your servant now say words into the ears of my master. Do not become angry at your servant. For you are like Paro. This is Yehuda's introductory statement. He goes into basically reviewing everything that's been going on between Yosef and the brothers. And how Yehuda says that if Binyamin does not return, Yaakov would die from pain of the fact that Binyamin has not returned. And that Yehuda should remain as a slave and let Binyamin go back. That's summing up what Yehuda does. But in this first pasuk, in this introduction, where Yehuda approaches Yosef, the Viceroy, not knowing it's Yosef yet, because right after Yehuda finishes his plea with Yosef, Yosef then reveals himself to his brothers. So Yehuda approaches Yosef and says these words, let your servant speak words in the ears of my master. Do not become angry at me, for you are like Paro. So Rashi's first interpretation to this statement, for you are like Paro, and which Rashi calls the Pshuta Shel Mikra, which means the basic interpretation, is that Yehuda says to Yosef, you're like Paro. I value you like Paro. I think you're as important as Paro, and therefore I don't want you to become angry at me. That's the simple interpretation. Rashi then brings a number of Midrashic interpretations, which are really messages that Yehuda was alluding to in his words to Yosef. And the last explanation that Rashi brings is that when Yehuda says "Kikamecha kafara," you're like Paro, that Yehuda is saying basically, "Imtak niteni," if you anger me, I'll kill you and Paro. He basically threatens Yosef and tells Yosef that if this doesn't work out right, I'll kill you and Paro. Okay. The Chassam Sefer, Ramosha Sefer, and the Chassam Sefer, who is known as the Chassam Sefer in his commentary on the Torah, puts together a couple of things here in Yehuda's discussion and brings out a very interesting point that explains what Yehuda was doing in a very interesting way. The Chassam Sefer has an interesting explanation to what it means that Yehuda threatens Yosef, I'll kill you in Paro, which we assume means that literally Yehuda threatened that, I'll kill you in Paro. And you kind of wonder, it's Yehuda and his brothers against Yosef in his palace. What can he really do? And even if he can kill Yosef, because Yosef is right here, he's going to get to Paro too. There's some interesting midrashim about that. But the Chassam Sefer is going to offer an explanation to this. And he, again, for the first thing he points out is the fact that, as I mentioned before, after Yehuda makes whatever lies in this introductory statement, and then reviews everything that happened, and pleads with Yosef to let Binyamin go back and let him remain as a slave, right after the charade's over, he can't hide himself anymore. What's the explanation? What exactly happened that at this point, Yosef has to reveal himself? Okay. Now, another thing now the Chassam Sefer, to begin his explanation, goes into a very interesting idea. And that is that we find in the Gemara that the king of Egypt was expected to know all languages that there were. And there's a very interesting interaction that takes place between Paro and Yosef. And this is based on a Gemara in Saita. The Gemara in Saita says that when after Yosef interpreted Paro's dreams, and Paro said that you're going to be in charge now. So Paro's servants turned to Paro and said, look, he's a slave. He was bought for 20 silver coins. That's not much. And now he's going to be the ruler over everyone. So Paro says, but I see royalty in him. I see a lot of talent in him, a lot of strength in him. So his wise men said to him, look, the rule is that to be a ruler in Egypt, you have to know all the languages that there are in the world. Does he know them? And that was going to be now, Paro was going to have to now test Yosef and see, would he know the languages? So the Gemara says that the angel Gabriel came and gave Yosef the wisdom to understand all the languages. And Paro went and engaged him in conversation. And every language that Paro used on him, Yosef knew. Great. So Yosef passed the test. But then Yosef turned to Paro and started speaking what the Gemara calls Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, the language of the Torah. The language that it's not modern Hebrew, we'll refer to it as Hebrew. Right? He started speaking Hebrew to him, the holy tongue. Paro didn't know what he was saying. So Paro then said to him, teach it to me. Tried teaching it to him, didn't go. So Paro now knew that Yosef had one up on him. That Yosef knew a language that he didn't know. And that didn't bode well for him being king then. So he made Yosef swear to him that you will not reveal this. And Yosef swore to it. Okay. That's at the end of the story. In next week's Parsha, Parsha's Vayigash, which is the Parsha where Yaakov dies. And Yaakov tells his children, and especially Yosef, who has the power to take care of it. He tells Yosef that when he dies, he wants to be buried in the land of Israel. And after he dies, Yosef approaches Paro, and he says to Paro the following, Ovi Hishbi Ani Lamar, my father made me swear. My father made me swear. Grave that he dug for himself in the land of Israel, that's where he wants to be buried. Allow me to go up now and bury him, and I'll come back. Paro responds, Go and bury your father as he made you swear. Now, why does Paro have to say, as he made you swear? Just say, go. So the Gemara says, because when Yosef actually made this request from Paro, so Paro said, no, I don't want you going. I don't want you burying him in the land of Israel. But Yosef says, my father made me swear to it. So Paro says, get an annulment of your oath. You got your brothers who are learned, and they'll annul your promise. So Yosef turns to Paro and says, okay, should I get the promise I made to you also annulled? That's when Paro says, all right, take your father to be buried as he made you swear, which means I'm not pleased with this, but he made you swear and you got me. So it comes very relevant later on, the fact that Paro didn't know these languages, and it's not something that he wanted anybody to know because it posed a danger to his being able to be the king. So the Chassam Sofer says the following when it comes to explain what was Yehuda doing here and what got Yosef to now reveal himself. So he says that when Yehuda, now we need a little introduction here. So the assumption is that Paro knows all languages and that Yosef knows all languages. And when Paro didn't know Lashon Kodesh, didn't know the Hebrew language, he didn't want to get it out. So how are we supposed to understand the fact that Torah says that when the brothers conversed with Yosef, that there was a meilitz bein Yosef, there was an interpreter in between them? What do you need an interpreter for? Doesn't Yosef understand all languages? What's the interpreter doing there? How can there be an interpreter there? And, what was an interpreter doing there if he couldn't understand all languages? Seems strange. Now, if the interpreter was there just because, well, foreigners don't speak to the king directly, and therefore you just have an interpreter there for the formalities of it, that is going to be a problem with something that the Chassam Sofer explained. It says to explain what's going on here. And I'm giving this introduction so that we can understand what the Chassam Sofer says. Because I think when we hear what the Chassam Sofer says, we're going to have a question. So I believe the answer is going to have to be, and it is a good question, unless you're going to say this idea of the interpreter is there as a formality. So it could very well be, we'll have to say, that the interpreter was there was actually maybe something that no one really knew other than Yosef and his brothers, meaning the brothers come to speak to Yosef. And it's not like, you expect that Yosef in his room in his palace would have lots of soldiers, lots of people around, which we know when he revealed himself to his brothers, he said, everybody leave. These are other people that were there. But it could very well be that when the discussions were going on between Yosef and his brothers, it was kind of very private. And no one really knew what was going on around there. They knew they were talking, but they weren't close up to see. And perhaps there was this interpreter there. Now, Yosef, I want an interpreter there that his brothers would talk their language, thinking that he doesn't understand it and he can hear what they're saying. That's why he had the interpreter there. But it could be that we may have to say that nobody knew this interpreter was there. Nobody knew it. No one knew it. Okay? So here we go now, what the Chassam Sofer explains. Chassam Sofer says like this. The Chassam Sofer says, Yehuda says to Yosef, let your servant speak now words into the ears of my master. What does this mean? Let me speak these words into your ears. Where else should these words go? So the Chassam Sofer cites his Rebbe, who was known as the Hafla, who explains that what Yehuda was saying right now is no more interpreter. We're talking directly. Because actually, Yehuda is saying to Yosef that, I don't believe that you don't understand what we're saying. Yosef, Yehuda's catching on. I don't believe that you don't know what's going on. I think you know what's going on, and the interpreter is just a show, and that's what he means. Don't get angry at me. I'm going to make these accusations that I think this is false. Why? For you are like Paro. Meaning, just like Paro is supposed to know languages, so are you. So what's this interpreter doing here exactly? And if you're going to tell me, well, maybe this is a language that Paro doesn't know either, so I don't have to know it. So Yehuda says, if you don't know it, tell everybody that you don't know it, and you're both going to be dead. When Yehuda says, I'm going to kill you and Paro, it doesn't mean Yehuda's going to draw a sword. It means he's going to go to the other people, tell them that they don't know Lashon Kodesh, they don't know the Hebrew language, and they'll depose them, which means they'll kill them first. So Yehuda is putting Yosef into a corner. And he's saying to him, look, I don't think this is true, what's going on here. You don't understand this. It's interesting. Now Yehuda starts thinking like, what's going on here? What's this interpreter doing here exactly? Yosef is supposed to understand us. So what's the interpreter there? And if that means that the interpreter is just a show. It's a facade. It's there to make us think something, but really you're eavesdropping on us. And if you really don't know, because hey, Paro doesn't know, so I don't have to know, then you're both going to be gone because I'm going to tell everybody about it. So this is where I was thinking. This is where we see that this is what Yehuda was saying to Yosef. And Yosef is in a corner now, because what's he going to do? If he says, I don't know, he's done. If he says, I do know, then he looks like a fool. because he was now playing games with them. And that's not appropriate for a king to do. Therefore, there was no choice anymore but to admit that he was Yosef. That's how the Chasam Sofer explains what happened here. But as I was thinking about this, I said to myself, hey, wait a minute. If Yosef, if the Egyptians expect Yosef to know all the languages, then what's the interpreter doing there? What's the interpreter doing there? And if there is some kind of excuse that it's just meant, and if there would be some kind of a formality that no one speaks directly, there has to be an interpreter, then Yehuda doesn't have a threat. So what is an interpreter? Interpreter can be there. I understand the language of the interpreter. That's the way it is. So therefore, I was thinking that it could very well be that, or it must be, that this interpreter was not necessarily so obvious that he was there to other people. And therefore, Yehuda said, I'm going to let everybody know what's going on, and that can get you in trouble. Okay, but it's a very interesting approach that the Chasam Sofer uses to explain what Yehuda was doing here. It works very well with the idea of Yehuda saying, let me speak into your ears, which is the point of Yehuda saying, no more interpreter, because you're like Paro means you should know all the languages, and when it says, I will kill you in Paro, means I'll inform upon you, and they will kill you to depose you from your position. Interesting explanation. The next thing the Chasam Sofer does is he goes into a discussion about, see, a little bit of a tangential thing. The idea that Paro didn't know the Hebrew language. The Chasam Sofer says that's very hard to understand because the land of Canaan was not that far from the land of Egypt. The Hebrews were recognized. Yaakov and his group, they were recognized. And everybody knew their language was this Hebrew language. So Paro wouldn't know it. Why wouldn't he know it? And we actually find that after Yosef reveals himself to his brothers, Yosef says to them, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that my mouth is speaking to you. Or that it is my mouth that is speaking to you. What does that mean? So Rashi says, it is my mouth that is speaking to you, means to say that Yosef was saying, where is this? Right. Yosef is saying, my mouth is speaking to you, the Lashon Kodesh, the Hebrew language. So look, Yosef is trying to say, look, it's me. I'm Yosef, because look, I'm speaking the Hebrew language. The Ramban Nachmanides asks, big deal. So you speak the Hebrew language. Is that so difficult that you can have an Egyptian speaking the Hebrew language? They're not that far from each other. Why wouldn't they be able to speak that language? And that the ruler shouldn't be able to speak the language, that's very difficult to understand. And the Gemara says that Paro said to Yosef, teach me. Didn't work. Okay, I mean, it didn't sound like he tried too much either. Teach me. Right now on the spot, teach me. Give yourself some more time. Take a couple of months. And secretly have Yosef teach you the Lashon Kodesh, the Hebrew language, so that you're not beholden to him. How are we supposed to understand this? So the Ramban, so the Chasam Sofer mentions goes into another interesting point, and that is that we call the Hebrew language of the Torah, Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue. And there's a very interesting discussion that goes on. Why is it called the holy language? What is holy about it? So you'll say, oh, it's holy because isn't that language the Torah is written in? But that was the language that Yaakov and his family spoke. So that's why it's written. Like, what's the big deal? They don't seem to say, well, that's the Torah's language. Okay, the Torah's language was a language that was spoken by Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and their descendants. That was the language they spoke. So that's what the Torah is written in. Why should that be called a holy language more than any other language? This is a question it's a big discussion in the Rishonim, the early commentaries. And the Ramban himself learns it's because that when Hashem spoke to a prophet, that was the language he spoke to. Received the prophecy and received the message from God. The message was in this Hebrew language. That's what made it the holy tongue. It's the holy tongue because God's messages to the prophets, as in the Torah, as in the books of the prophets, where they're relating the prophecy as it was given in the Hebrew language. That's what makes it holy. The Chassam Sofer says, I'm going to offer an explanation, and it's going to be an explanation that actually is, or an explanation that says that what he calls Ivri, Lashon Ivri, the Hebrew language, which would be the language that was spoken by Yaakov and his family, is not the same thing as Lashon Kodesh. Not the same thing. It's the same words. They share the same words, but it's not the same thing. Speaking Hebrew does not mean you're speaking Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue. It explains in the following way. There is a pasuk in Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, Elginas Egoi Zeradati. I went down to a garden of egos, of nuts. And the Medrash tells us, what is this garden of nuts? It's referring to the place where we study Torah, to the Beis HaMedrash, the study hall. And the Chassam Sofer doesn't bring the source, but he says he found that the word Ginas, which again is spelled Gimel Nun Taf, which means, with translation of that word is the translation is the garden of. If you take that word and turn it into an acronym, which means every letter stands for a word, you will come out with 3 words. I'll say those 3 words and I'll explain it. The Gimel of Ginas is Gematria. The Nun of Ginas is Nutrikun. And the Taf of Ginas is Tamura. What does that mean? So I think Gematria, many of us are familiar with. Gematria means numerology. I don't know what the exact word is. Every letter of the Aleph Beis of the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value. And when you take the letters of a word and you take the value of each letter and you add them together, you take the sum, and then you relate that sum to other words that have the same value, and that reveals another layer of interpretation to the words. So we have what's called pshat. We have the basic interpretation, and then we have another dimension of the word of the Torah where gematria, using the numerical value, reveals another layer of meaning. Then we have something called nutrika. Nutrika means being an acronym. You take the letters of a word, and you take each letter represents a word itself. Like in this case, Ginas. Ginas is a word to itself, but then you take each letter, and it represents a word, which then reveals to us something more to what's going on here. Okay, which really means, as we're going to see, as the Chassam Sofer says, the word Ginas, as he said, the Ginas, the garden, means where we study Torah. And now, being that the word Ginas is also lies in it, these words are really telling us what lies in Torah. But let me get to the last part. The Taf is Tamura. Tamura means switching letters. There's another way, another dimension of interpreting the Torah where letters can be switched for other letters. There's something called atbash, which means you take the first letter and the last letter and you switch them. And then you take the next letter and the next letter and switch them. So the first and last is Aleph and Taf, you switch them. You have Beis and Shin, you switch them. The switching also forms messages, words, ideas, which mean and reveals us another layer of understanding. So this word Ginas, El Ginas Egos, to the garden of the nut, means the garden, which is a study hall, which represents the Torah, means that every word of the Torah has these 3 dimensions to them. It has gematria, the numerical value. It could be an acronym. It could be switched. But the letters can be switched around. That is what every word of the Torah has in it. There's a commentary called Baal HaTurim that very often deals with the numerical value and relates different words. I'm going to assume that, we can make gematrias galore, right? We can sum up everything. And do we know exactly the connection between everything? Perhaps not. But the point is, though, that there is the numerical value, and it has a value, and because of that value, it can now show us another dimension to the meaning, to what the word means, what the word represents. That is what the words of Torah are. And the Chassam Sofer continues. Friday is going to be Asara B'Tevis, the fast of Asara B'Tevis, where we commemorate the siege of Yerushalayim. Leading up to Asara B'Tevis, there were other the days before that were also considered very tragic days, because during that period of time, the Greek king Ptolemy gathered all the Jewish sages together and had them translate the Torah that was called the Septuagint. Now, it's considered very tragic. Considered very tragic, says the Chassam Sofer, because number one, you don't, in other languages, you don't have these other three dimensions. No language has these dimensions of the numerical value and the acronyms and the switching. No other language has that. Only the Holy Tongue has that. Nothing else has that. So when you now take the Torah and you give it a form, a Greek form, you lose out on that. And the problem is that many Jews began only studying the Torah in that form, which means that we're going to now lose out of those levels of interpretation. Also, says the Chassam Sofer, by translating into Greek, you now left it open for, call it Greek interpretation. If it was now open for the Greeks to now read it, they would now apply their understandings, which of course would be destructive to the meaning, to what the Torah really means. But that was part of the tragedy of now giving it this form and now only being studied in that form. It now lent itself to losing out on all those dimensions. So what the Chassam Sofer's point is that every word of the Torah has these dimensions. The Torah is Lashon Kodesh. That's not a question. It's the Holy Tongue. The question is why. Chassam Sofer says, you know why it's called the Holy Tongue? Because every word has more than just its basic interpretation. It has these other levels, these other dimensions. Every word has that. The Lashon Ivri, the Hebrew language, when spoken just as a language, doesn't have that. Doesn't have those dimensions. It's a language like any other language. It only becomes Lashon Kodesh when it's spoken in a way that it has those dimensions. And how do you do that? How is it spoken to have those dimensions? The answer is it has to be divinely inspired. It has to be written with the Ruach HaKodesh. It has to be written with the divine spirit, divine inspiration, whether it be prophecy, whether it be a lower level than prophecy that's called Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, but it has to have that. In order to be able to speak the Holy Tongue, in order to be able to take the Hebrew language and turn it to the Holy Tongue, which means it now has these dimensions to them, these other dimensions of meaning to them, that can only happen if they are spoken or given over with Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. For a person to speak Lashon Kodesh, for a person to be able to speak in a way that these other dimensions are there, he has to be speaking those words because he's experiencing Ruach HaKodesh. He experiences divine inspiration. And therefore his words, again, in the Hebrew language, but then the words of the Hebrew language can now take on these dimensions. But you have to be what's called the Baal Ruach HaKodesh. You have to be someone that possesses that divine inspiration to talk that way. And if you were to recognize that someone's speaking with the Lashon Kodesh, Holy Tongue, that person has to have Ruach HaKodesh to be able to see that this is being spoken that way. When Yosef says to his brothers, Kapia Medaber Aleichem, my mouth is speaking to you. My mouth is speaking Lashon Kodesh. He's saying to them, the words that I say to you, you see they have these dimensions to them. Because actually, what there is an interpretation to some of the words that Yosef uses when he speaks to his brothers, that when you take the numerical value, it reveals something more that Yosef was trying to say. I'm not going to get into that right now. But Yosef is saying, look, I speak Ruach HaKodesh. That means, I speak Lashon HaKodesh. I speak the holy tongue. That means that I possess Ruach HaKodesh. And you know that because you possess Ruach HaKodesh. You possess divine inspiration to be able to see that. And you can't fake it. You can't fake Ruach HaKodesh. It has to be real. So when Yosef is telling his brothers, look, I speak Ruach HaKodesh, that means you should see that I'm not just some Egyptian. I'm Yosef, and I'm still the old Yosef, because I still have the Ruach HaKodesh to speak this holy tongue, this Lashon Kodesh. And now getting back to the question that the Chassam Sefer asked to begin with. What does it mean Paro didn't know Lashon Kodesh? What do you mean he didn't know Hebrew? How could it be? This is not that far away. He's the king. He's supposed to know. Why wouldn't he know? The answer is he knew Hebrew, but he didn't know Lashon Kodesh. So when he was going out and speaking to Yosef, they spoke Hebrew. Sure they did. Manashma. They spoke Hebrew to each other. But then Yosef pulled the Lashon Kodesh on him. Yosef spoke to him Lashon Kodesh, and he gave Paro the understanding, meaning Paro couldn't sense it on his own, but he gave Paro an understanding. Look, I'm speaking in a way that has these dimensions. Paro says, ooh, I can't do that. Can you teach me? Yosef maybe showed him something, but he couldn't teach. Paro couldn't get it because in the fact that Paro doesn't have Ruach HaKodesh. Without Ruach HaKodesh, without divine inspiration, you can't speak Lashon Kodesh. You can't speak the holy tongue. And that's why he couldn't teach it to him, because it can't be taught. And when he went ahead and he wanted to prove to his brothers, look, it's me, I am Yosef, then the point is that he was trying to say to his brothers, look, it's not just I know the language, like the Ramban says. For the Egyptian to know Hebrew, that's not so surprising. But it wasn't Hebrew. It was Lashon Kodesh. It was the holy tongue. It was the Hebrew language spoken in a way that it has the gematria, nutrikon, tamura. It has the dimensions of the numerical value. It can be turned into an acronym. You can switch the letters, and all these three things bring out more dimensions, more layers of understanding to the word, of more meaning to the word. That's what Yosef was speaking. And that is how Yosef proved to them that it's me, it's Yosef. Can't fake the Lashon Kodesh. You can't fake it. You can't just act like you're doing it, because you have to have Ruach HaKodesh, have divine inspiration for that. And therefore, Yosef says you should be able to recognize it's me, and it's not just me, it's the old me. I'm the same Yosef. I haven't changed. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful evening.